The sun had fallen low, bleeding gold into the horizon, as if heaven itself had tired of watching the living suffer. The desert stretched endlessly, shimmering like an ocean of heat and silence. A single figure moved within it, slow, stumbling, a shadow nearly consumed by the dunes. Her dress, once soft and cream-colored, now clung to her like wilted petals. Her lips were cracked, her hands raw from clawing at the dry ground. Evelyn May had not spoken in hours, but her thoughts whispered louder than the wind. They left me for dead. The words escaped her throat at last, dry and trembling, half prayer, half confession. They drifted into the empty air, where only the wind answered, sweeping sand over her footprints. The wagon train had vanished days ago. She had slowed them down, they said. She had become a curse on the road west. And when fever took her, they moved on, merciful, they called it. She remembered the wheels turning away, the dust swallowing them whole, and then only sky, sand, and her own failing heart. Somewhere far off, a horse neighed, a sound so sudden and alive that her weak legs buckled in fright. From over a rise came a man on horseback, his coat dusted gray, his hat tilted low. He slowed when he saw her, studying the sight as one might study a mirage. For a moment he wondered if she were real. The desert often played cruel tricks. But when she fell to her knees, he was off the horse before thinking. He reached her just as she slumped forward. Her skin was hot, her pulse faint but steady. "You breathing?" he muttered, his voice a low rasp shaped by dust and long miles. Her eyelids fluttered, but she made no sound. He lifted her into his arms, light as an empty promise, and carried her to a shaded hollow beneath a crumbling ridge. The man's name was Caleb Rowe, though he hadn't spoken it aloud in weeks. He had been riding alone, avoiding towns, avoiding memories. The West was wide enough for a man to disappear if he wanted it bad enough. Yet now, as he poured a few drops of water past her lips, he found himself staring at her face longer than he meant to. The faint rise of her chest, the quiet fight still in her breathing, it pulled something from a place he thought had long gone cold. When she stirred, dusk had crept over the sky. Her eyes blinked open, blue as evening. "The settlers," she whispered, voice thin as thread. "They left me behind." Caleb watched her a long moment. His jaw tightened, his gaze on the fading light beyond. "Not while I breathe," he said, almost to himself. They said little after that. The desert cooled, the stars arrived, and the night pressed close. He made a small fire, the smoke curling upward like a fragile prayer. She watched him from the edge of the flames glow, her expression wary, but her body too weak for fear. When he offered her a strip of dried meat, she shook her head. He didn't insist. He simply pushed the canteen toward her. As the fire crackled, Evelyn's eyes filled with the shadows of memory, the faces of those who had turned away, the sharpness of their pity. She wanted to hate them, but hate took strength she didn't have. Instead, she looked at this stranger, at the quiet way he stared into the fire, and wondered why he hadn't left her too. By morning, the air had softened. The desert shimmered pale gold, and Caleb was mending his saddle straps, his hands sure and silent. Evelyn sat wrapped in a blanket he'd laid beside her. "I slowed them down," she said suddenly. "That's why they left me." He didn't look up. "Folks talk foolish when they're scared." Her voice quivered. Maybe they were right. He gave a faint snort, half laugh, half sigh. "Ain't no right in leaving someone to die." She studied him. He looked like a man made of edges, jaw sharp, eyes shadowed, every line carved by sun and loss. "What scares you, Mr. Rowe?" she asked. His hands paused. Then he gave a small, crooked smile without mirth. "Ain't met a fear yet that didn't come wearing my own face." They shared a silence that wasn't empty but alive, filled with wind and unspoken things. She began helping him gather brush for the fire, though her steps were shaky. Every small act, passing him the tinder, brushing dust from her skirt, seemed to knit her slowly back into the world. He noticed she hummed faintly under her breath, some half-forgotten tune that belonged to another life. He didn't ask about it, but the sound followed him even when she stopped. By the third evening, the wind shifted west. Caleb said they'd reach Red Hollow by nightfall if they kept steady. She nodded, though her strength waned again. When they arrived, the town was little more than a cluster of wooden shacks and one crooked saloon glowing with lamplight. The place smelled of whiskey, horses, and the loneliness of men too long without kindness. Caleb led her through the door. Conversations stilled. A dozen eyes turned on them, on her torn dress, her weary face, the dust that clung to her hair. The barkeep squinted. "You bring her in from the wild, cowboy?" he said, a sneer hiding behind his words. Caleb set 2 silver coins on the counter. "She eats first. You talk later." No one argued after that. They sat in a corner while she sipped broth, each spoonful trembling between her fingers. He didn't speak, only watched the door, as though ready for the world to turn cruel again. When they stepped back into the night, rain had begun to fall, soft and hesitant, as if unsure how to bless this dry earth. They found an empty barn at the town's edge. He spread his coat over the hay for her to rest. The roof leaked in small, rhythmic drops. She listened to it a while before speaking. "They all looked at me like I was something strange," she said. Caleb sat near the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light. "Maybe you are," he said quietly. "But sometimes ghosts just need to start living again." She smiled faintly, though tears glimmered in her eyes. "Do you believe that?" He didn't answer right away. "I reckon I've seen worse things come back to life." The rain thickened, filling the air with a silver hum. Evelyn watched it, the steady rhythm easing her into sleep. Caleb leaned his head back against the wall, listening to her breathing even out, slow and sure. Something inside him, something long buried under guilt and dust, began to loosen, like thawed ground after a hard winter. Outside, the storm rolled across the plains, washing the desert clean for another dawn. Inside the barn, 2 souls who'd been lost to the world had found a fragile, wordless truce. When Evelyn finally drifted into dreams, Caleb stayed awake, watching the rain shimmer through the cracks in the roof. He didn't know what waited beyond Red Hollow, whether the road would lead him back into loneliness or toward something new, but for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about where to run. He only knew he couldn't leave her behind. And somewhere between the thunder and the whisper of her breath, he felt the desert, cruel, endless, ancient, grow quiet, as if it too were holding its breath, waiting to see what would come next. Morning came soft and golden, a thin ribbon of light slipping through the barn's cracks and settling across Evelyn's face. She stirred, half dreaming, half awake, and for a fleeting moment forgot where she was. Then she saw him, Caleb, already saddling his horse outside, his movements steady, deliberate, like a man who'd long learned not to waste words. The air smelled faintly of wet hay and rain-washed dust. "Where will you go?" she asked quietly as she rose, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. He looked back over his shoulder. "West for now. Always west." He adjusted the reins, then nodded toward her. "You'll ride with me till the next town. You ain't fit to walk yet." Her brow furrowed. "Why?" He hesitated, then shrugged as though the truth embarrassed him. "Because the world's cruel enough without leavin' another soul behind." That answer lingered between them longer than any promise could. She climbed onto the horse behind him, her hands light against his coat, her heart unsure. The road opened before them in muted silence, broken only by the wind sighing over the open plain. By midday, the sun had burned through the clouds. The land shimmered with heat again, miles of desolation interrupted by the skeletons of old mesquite trees. They rode without speaking, their shadows long and trembling over the sand. Evelyn watched the horizon, trying to imagine a future she could believe in. Every few moments she caught herself glancing at the back of his neck, the faint scar there, the way he rode with an easy kind of defiance, as if daring the world to test him again. The sound of hooves broke the stillness. Caleb's body stiffened before she heard them. Dust rose behind, a group of riders, 5 maybe 6, their figures dark against the light. He slowed the horse, eyes narrowing. When they drew closer, Evelyn's breath hitched. She knew those faces. The settlers. Her settlers. They reined in about 20 paces off, horses stamping, faces rough with sun and shame. The man in front, a broad-shouldered brute with a cracked hat and mean eyes, spat into the sand. "We thought you were gone, girl." Evelyn's hands trembled against the saddle. "You left me," she said, voice barely above a whisper. The man's lip curled. "We had to move. You slowed us down. Ain't no room for dead weight on the trail." Caleb's jaw tightened. He swung his leg off the horse and stepped forward, his revolver hanging loose but ready at his side. "You left her to die," he said evenly, each word like a nail driven into wood. "You got one chance to ride on." The men laughed, a hard, nervous sound that echoed across the plain. One reached for his weapon. The crack of Caleb's revolver split the air before the man's hand even brushed metal. The bullet struck the ground inches from his boot, throwing up dust. The laughter stopped. Caleb's eyes didn't waver. "That was your warning." The leader scowled, muttered a curse, and jerked his reins. Within seconds, they were retreating into the horizon, swallowed by heat and fear. Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest. When Caleb turned back to her, his face was calm again, as if nothing had happened. She saw no triumph there, only weariness. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. He holstered his gun. "Yeah," he murmured. "But someone needed to." They made camp that evening near a dried riverbed, the last light burning orange across the sand. Evelyn sat beside the fire, turning the events over in her mind. "They were my people," she said. "And still, they left me." Caleb stared into the flames. "Blood don't make you family. Loyalty does." She was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved her hair like a whisper. "I was engaged once," she said finally, voice trembling. "He died before the journey. After that, I was just something to pity. Something to leave behind." He didn't speak at first. Then, slowly, "Ain't no shame in surviving. It's the hardest thing to do out here." Her eyes glistened in the firelight. "Why did you help me then? You could have ridden on." He leaned forward, feeding another branch into the flames. "Because someone once left me, too. I figure saving you might set something right." The honesty in his voice reached her more deeply than any kindness could. They sat in silence, two ghosts of different storms, bound by the same ache. The desert wind moaned through the empty trees like a hymn for the broken. Later that night, the sky turned dark as ink. A gust of wind swept through camp, scattering embers. Caleb stood suddenly, scanning the horizon. "Storm's comin'." Within minutes, the air howled. The sand lifted into a furious cloud, the world vanishing beneath a veil of dust. Evelyn coughed, shielding her face. "I can't see," she cried. Caleb grabbed her hand, pulling her close as the storm roared around them. "Stay low," he shouted. They stumbled toward a cluster of rocks, half crawling, half fighting against the wind. Sand clawed at their skin, filled their lungs, turned the night into chaos. When they reached the shelter of a boulder, he wrapped his coat around her, pressing her close against his chest. "I can't," she tried to speak, but the words vanished in the gale. "You can," he said, his voice fierce and steady in her ear. "Not while I breathe." The storm raged for hours, roaring like a living thing, testing the limits of their endurance. Each time the wind threatened to tear them apart, his arm tightened around her. She clung to him, burying her face in his shoulder, feeling his heart pounding, proof that something still defied the storm. When dawn finally broke, the desert was unrecognizable. The sand lay sculpted in new ridges and valleys, the old world erased overnight. Evelyn opened her eyes to a silence so complete it felt sacred. Caleb was beside her, his face gray with exhaustion but alive. She smiled faintly. "You stayed," she whispered. He managed a weary grin. "Told you I would." They rose slowly, brushing sand from their clothes. The air was cool now, the sky a pale wash of blue. In the distance, the faint shimmer of water, perhaps a spring, caught the morning light. Hope, fragile and unfamiliar, stirred in her chest. By the time the sun climbed high, they reached it, a small pool fed by an underground trickle, surrounded by tufts of green. Caleb knelt, cupping water in his hands, and passed it to her first. She drank, laughing softly for the first time since he'd found her. "Seems the desert ain't all death after all," she said. He smiled, that rare, quiet smile that never reached his eyes but meant more for its restraint. "No," he said. "Sometimes it gives back what it almost took." Weeks later, they built a small shelter near that spring, using the remnants of an old trading post. The wind still whispered across the dunes, but it sounded different now, less cruel, almost kind. Caleb taught her to ride again. She taught him to laugh without guilt. When travelers passed and asked who they were, he'd answer simply, "Two souls the desert forgot to bury." At dusk, Evelyn would sometimes sit by the water's edge, watching the sun melt into the sand, and think of that day, when the world had nearly taken her, and a stranger's voice had defied it with a single promise, "Not while I breathe." And somewhere deep inside her, she began to believe that sometimes the fiercest kind of love wasn't born from passion, but from mercy, the quiet, stubborn mercy of two wounded hearts that refused to let the other die. The wind carried that truth across the plains, soft as prayer, endless as the desert itself.